Hey, this is Shane Long, wedding and portrait photographer based in Minnesota and Florida, and the delivery truck just dropped off for me the brand new RF 50mm 1.8. I am super excited to add this little lens to my kit. So we brought it out in the field today because I want to see how the $200 lens compares to my $2,000 RF 50mm 1.2. So in this video, I hope to compare the sharpness, the image quality, the lens flare, chromatic aberrations, anything that I notice as I'm looking through the photos, and most of all, the background blur. Here we go. The first question is why? Why an RF 50mm 1.8? Well, I want to show you the difference here between starting out with the kit lens and what the photos look like with the kit lens compared to the RF 50mm 1.8. Here we have on the kit lens 24 to 105, f4 to 7.1. I'm shooting it at 50mm. We're going to compare these photos. So give me that nice smile right here. 3, 2, 1. Perfect. Now we're going to compare that shot to the RF 50mm 1.8 and see how the background looks. 3, 2, and 1. If you are just starting out and you have the kit lens that came with your camera, they are great versatile lenses. However, they don't have wide apertures. At as close to 50mm that I could get with this lens, the widest aperture I could use was f5. Looking at these two images side by side, the difference is even more exaggerated. Here's the 24 to 105 taken at f5, and here's the RF 50mm 1.8 at 1.8. The subject pops out of the photo. And if we look at the background here, the difference between 1.8 and 5 is tremendous. So if you're looking for a lens that right away will up your game, this RF 50mm 1.8 will take you to a whole new level over the kit lens. But keep the kit lens for those times where you need the versatility. Here are the lenses we'll be comparing today. The RF 50mm 1.8 to the EF version, and the RF 50mm 1.8 to the RF 50mm 1.2. One of the first things I'm curious about right away is sharpness. So let's compare the RF 50 compared to the EF 50. Perfect, don't move. 3, 2, and 1.
I was singing the sound when you were recording.
Perfect. On this side I have the new RF 50mm 1.8 straight out of camera, and on this one the EF 50mm 1.8. If we zoom into the eye here, they look pretty similar. Maybe just ever so slightly sharper here on the new RF 50mm 1.8 compared to the old EF version, but not significantly different. Now I'm going to pop over to the L version, the $2,000 lens, and we will see a pretty significant difference here. Here we are at 3 to 1, and you can tell that the eye is a lot sharper, the eyebrow, everything looks a little bit more crisp on that version. But if you're printing a 4x6, 8x10, you won't notice a significant difference here in sharpness for those size of prints. Here is the RF 50mm 1.8, and here is the EF 50mm 1.8. I took these photos so that we could compare the sharpness when the subject is composed near the edge of the frame. And this one does get interesting. So check out her boots. These little frills here look nice, sharp, and contrasty on the new RF version, whereas they look a little hazy, kind of blurry, not as crisp on the older EF version. And even just the detail in the ground here, right where it hits the focal plane, you can tell it looks a little mushy on the old EF version, whereas on the new RF version, it does look much more crisp and contrasty. So that's a really good sign that they did make some optical improvements here on the new RF version. Now we have the RF 50mm 1.8 here again on this side, and the RF 50mm 1.2 on this version. So let's see how the $2,000 compares to the $200. You will notice pretty quick here that the RF 1.2 does have more contrast and more detail wide open at the edge of the frame. So this was taken at 1.2, this was taken at 1.8. So even at 1.2, this the L version is sharper, but for $200, this is a really good value. I love the surreal, almost magical feeling these lenses can give you when you're out in a forest like this. Especially here on the 1.2 version where the subject is just razor sharp and then the background just blurs away. Lastly, for image quality, I took comparison photos of this tree. So if we zoom in straight on the tree, they actually look pretty similar in the center of the frame. As we scroll down though, it does get more interesting here. So the new RF version compared to the EF version, the RF version is sharper as we get near the edge of the frame. And it is really interesting when we get down here and start looking at these pine trees down here. The EF version gets kind of soft and mushy here at the edge of the frame here, whereas the RF version remains its sharpness. When we go into the corners here, the RF version remains pretty sharp, whereas the EF version is pretty mushy. This tree is nice and sharp, this tree is pretty mushy. And that story continues into the top corner of the frame here, where this tree is kind of sharp. This one kind of has a hazy, less contrasty. Now comparing the RF 51.8 to the 1.2, if we zoom in, the 1.2 is sharper, has more background blur. If we come over here to the trees, there is still some chromatic aberrations in both of the images, green and purple. Into the corners, the 1.2 does win here. You just have to decide if that's worth the extra cost for you. One thing to note as well is they both do have some pretty heavy vignetting that is easily corrected in Lightroom. However, at the time of this making, they don't have the profile yet for the RF 51.8. So I have just been going in, selecting Canon, and then choosing the old EF version since they are pretty similar in image quality, and that seems to be removing the vignetting pretty well. When I was first starting out doing photography, I really wasn't aware of the fringing issue that lenses can have. So here you can see in high contrast situations, we got the bright sun behind this tree branch here. You're gonna get this ugly kind of purple mess when shooting at 1.8. It's really pretty easily corrected here in Lightroom. So here I am in the develop module. Under lens corrections, I can come down here under the defringe slider here, and those purple highlights will start to fade away. Now I want to compare lens flares. Let's look at how the $200 lens compares to the $2,000 lens. I actually think the $200 RF 1.8 does really well maintaining contrast even when the sun is shining directly into the lens. Here are the artifacts when shot at f1.8, and now here are the artifacts and what they look like at f8. I love using my Canon cameras for my own personal home videos. Often though, I don't have time to put on an external mic. And with the large apertures and big focusing motors in these L lenses, a clicking noise can be heard in the video footage. This new 50mm 1.8 though features a silent STM motor, and in my tests I didn't hear it in my video footage. So this will be a dream for me when I'm taking vacation videos, home videos. I might put this 50mm 1.8 on more often than not. The RF 50mm 1.8 has a great little focusing motor in it. In my tests, it was able to go from infinite focus to minimum focus in no time at all, quickly and accurately. It was even more silent than the previous version, the EF 50mm 1.8. Also, I was surprised to find that when I did the side-by-side video test to check out the flare, that the RF 50mm 1.8 held focus better than the RF 50mm 1.2. The 1.2 lost the subject a couple times and went out of focus, whereas I noticed that the RF 50mm 1.8, maybe because it only has a 1.8 aperture, but it didn't lose the subject's face as quickly, and it seemed to regain focus more quickly. One important thing to note is that this lens does not have an AF-MF switch. Rather, it has a focus control switch. I don't find this to be a negative, as I rarely use manual focus, and I would rather have the size benefits of having a smaller lens and have the ring be whatever setting I've programmed it to be. If, however, I do want to manually focus, I need to go into the settings, go into the autofocus settings, and switch the focus control from autofocus to manually focusing. This process is a little bit cumbersome, and it takes a little bit more time than just flipping a switch, but at least it gives me the option to program that ring to either be in focus or be in control. One thing you do want to make sure is that you've updated your camera to the latest firmware so that you get all of that functionality. Also note that the barrel extends when focusing with this lens. To be sure that the autofocus motor doesn't get damaged, when you turn the camera off, give the lens time to retract the barrel before removing the lens. Also be sure to never set the lens on the top of the lens, because that weight of the lens and camera can put pressure on that motor and end up damaging it. Let's look at the build quality. I'm actually kind of impressed here. For $200, you have a very sturdy plastic lens, but it doesn't feel cheap. The focus control ring turns very smoothly. The front element of the glass only needs a 43mm filter thread. And as we look at the back of the lens, unlike a few years ago when we had a plastic mount, this new metal mount clicks very nicely into my R cameras. Now let's look at size comparisons. Here it is next to the EF 50mm 1.8. I do appreciate the compact size of this lens, though they are similar in size. Because the EF version needs to be adapted to the new RF camera system, that similar size is lost once you adapt it to the new cameras with one of the adapters. For my use of portraits and wedding photography, I prefer this Canon control ring mount adapter. I'll have a link to my review of it above, and you can get it in the description down below, but it just allows you one more ring that you can customize to control your camera. So if you are someone who wants both the manual focus ability and the control ring adapter at the same time, then you might want to go with the EF version because of that ability. Just because I know there is some confusion out there, I wanted to make it really clear. So the new RF 50mm 1.8 only works on the new Canon RF mirrorless cameras. The older version works on the older Canon DSLRs, and it can be adapted to the new RF mirrorless system. It actually has to do with the distance the lens is from the sensor. Finally, here's the RF 50 1.8 compared to the RF 50 1.2. The new 51.8 is so small and so light, it makes the R5 feel a little large, whereas the RF 51.2 balances perfectly, is built like a tank, and feels like it's going to last forever. As I said earlier in the video, one of the best reasons for getting a prime lens is the background blur. It will very quickly set your images apart and make them look much more professional. So let's take a look now at the background blur on the RF 50mm 1.8 compared to the EF 50mm 1.8 and the RF 50mm 1.2. Can you give me a happy smile? There it is, 3, 2, 1. Here's a shot taken with the new RF 50mm 1.8. It has a great feel to it, a big upgrade over the kit lens. The background blurs away nicely and the subject pops out. Here it is compared to the RF 50mm 1.2. This is how much more background blur you will get in that image. Zooming in, you can see what happens kind of to the trees in the background. These ones just remain a little bit more harsh here, where the circles just kind of don't smooth out, whereas the 1.2 version, everything just kind of becomes buttery smooth. The bokeh looks fantastic. The circles are larger and they don't seem to have as much of an outline to them as they do in the 1.8 version. Let's compare the RF 50mm 1.8 to the EF 50mm 1.8 on just kind of a standard vertical portrait here, unedited. If we zoom in here, let's compare the bokeh so you can just see they're very, very similar. So if you're looking to upgrade simply based on the background blur, there's not a big difference here between these two lenses. Now let's compare the 1.2 version to the 1.8 version. And here there is a big difference. You can see though on the 1.2 version, the background just gets obliterated, it melts away. On the 1.8 version, it does blur. It's just not quite as smooth. It has a little bit more of a harsh feel to it. Elements that are almost completely gone in this side on the 1.2 version, you can still make them out a little bit more on the 1.8 version. One side note too here that I am noticing as I'm going through these images is the color is a little different. The 1.8 version has a little bit more of a pink feel to it in the skin tones compared to the 1.2 version. One thing that I did find surprising, the 1.8 did better in the lens flare test. So when the sun hit the lens, this one didn't wash out as much as my 1.2 version. I've brought you downtown here because one of my favorite times of year to take photos with amazing bokeh is during the Christmas season. Sometime I hope to make a video showing you how to get all the beautiful background blur during the Christmas season, but today I want to give you one tip. The tip is don't put the subject right next to the tree, pull them off farther away from the tree, because the farther away the subject is from the tree, the larger your background blur will be and the more beautiful it will be. Perfect, and now we're going to do this lens. Here's this image now, straight out of camera, no editing, and you can tell just by bringing that subject away from the tree, you get this beautiful blurred background with these these beautiful bokeh circles here kind of in the background. The 1.2 version does have a larger aperture, so you can tell that the bokeh circles do get bigger and have that kind of beautiful magical feel to them. Either one would create a great image for you if you want the $200 version or the $2,000 version. I know for me personally, when I buy a lens, I really like to see the background blur before I buy it. It's one of the reasons I love Canon. Their background blur is just unbelievable. So here we are, this is the RF 50mm 1.8. Here it is compared to the older version now. This is the EF version 1.8. You can kind of tell the difference between the two. Both these images were taken on a tripod, and so it is interesting as I'm jumping back and forth between these two images that the new RF version is slightly wider than the older EF version. If we compare it now to the RF 1.2, the RF 1.2 is a little bit more zoomed in, but the background blur is significantly larger. Here they are side by side so that we can zoom in and just take a look at how different the background blur is. So that 1.2, yes, the bokeh is significantly larger than it is on the 1.8. The last comparison I wanted to do between the two lenses was shooting them both at f2 so I could see how does the background blur look if they're at the same aperture. So this is the RF 1.8 shot at f2, and this is the RF 1.2 shot at f2. So here, if you're after more of the circular highlights, this is where you get at f2. You're gonna have more circular highlights with the RF 1.2. When you get to the edge, yes, they are just slightly more rounded out. I came back inside now to test out some of the low light abilities of the RF 50mm 1.8. It's what I'm using to record myself right now. Canon says that with the in-body stabilization on the R5 and the R6, that you can get up to 7 stops of image stabilization. So I want to try that out now. We're going to try taking photos here on the EOS R that doesn't have in-body stabilization, and then I'm going to put the RF 50mm 1.8 on my R5 and see what kind of shutter speeds I can get with that. All right, let's take a look now at these images taken without any in-body stabilization. So this was taken on the EOS R. I started at 1/125th of a second, and that image is nice and sharp. It continues here at 1/60th of a second, still nice and sharp. At 1/30th of a second, the image is just starting to get a little bit blurry. And if it continues here at 1/15th, still getting a little more blurry. And at 1/8th of a second, this isn't even usable anymore. So then I put the lens on my R5 and it is nice and razor sharp. It continues here 1/60th of a second, 1/30th of a second, 1/15th. This is where I lost it here with the R. Still sharp. Here we are at 1/8th of a second, still sharp. 1/4 of a second, still pretty sharp here. And then I went to a 1/2 a second, and that's where I lost the stabilization. So it looks like I can pretty safely shoot down to about a 1/4 of a second, which is really pretty amazing because that allowed me in this near dark situation. At 1/4 of a second, I could shoot at ISO 500 and have a nice clean image. Whereas with the R, I probably would have had to shoot, I think at 1/30th is where it was still sharp. So I was looking more at ISO 4000 on that image. Though I already had the RF 50mm 1.2, I pre-ordered the 50mm 1.8 the minute it was available, simply because these new RF lenses are incredible, and I knew Canon would do a fantastic job with it. It's the perfect little lens to have in my emergency backup kit, which I keep in my car. I have lenses and cameras in there so that if something goes wrong on the wedding day, I know I always have a backup kit in my car. I will also use this lens for travel photography. It will be fantastic to take to Florida with me, to use on the beach, knowing that if something goes wrong with this little lens, it's cheaper to replace the lens than it is to send this one in for a repair, which oftentimes when I repair my L lenses, it costs more than $200. If you are just starting out, buy this lens right away. For $200, you will not find a lens that will up your game as quickly. You will go from taking very basic photos with the kit lens to taking more wow photos with this RF 50mm 1.8. It will do great things for you in low light and give you a beautiful background blur. For only $200, this RF 50mm 1.8 will give you 90% of what this $2,000 RF 50mm 1.2 will do. That said, if you're a full-time pro like me and you want to deliver the very best creamy, buttery smooth backgrounds, the RF 50mm 1.2 can't be beat. The backgrounds just blur away while the subjects remain perfectly sharp. As always, I will have links in the description where you can pick up any of this gear. Using the links won't cost you any extra, but will help support me in making these videos. Thank you so much for watching. If this video was helpful for you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. I have a lot more fun stuff coming for you. We'll see you next time. I've waited to the very end here to show you my favorite feature about this lens, and it's actually the lens cap. This thing is tiny. It feels like a little toy. Here it is compared to my 85mm 1.2 lens cap. Just the sweetest little thing.